October 1878. On a raw shoulder of the Red Desert, where Wyoming Territory begins to climb toward the granite country, a man was trying to push a house into the earth. Not build one, not raise one, push one in. The thing in front of him had once been a freight wagon box. Its wheels were gone, its tongue was gone, its iron fittings had been stripped back to the ribs. All that remained was a long wooden shell, scarred by alkali dust and years of hauling flour, nails, and stovepipe across country that did not forgive bad judgment. Nils Torvald had hitched that wooden shell to a rope. The rope ran through a block nailed to a juniper trunk. The juniper groaned every time he leaned into the capstan. Inch by inch, the freight box slid toward a black seam under a sandstone bluff. Down on the wagon road, men stopped their teams to watch. One of them laughed first, then another. By the time Ezra Clapp, the county road viewer, reined in his mule, half the trail had decided they were witnessing a man lose his mind in public. Clapp had a notebook in his coat pocket, a measuring chain in his saddlebag, and the permanent expression of a man who trusted straight lines more than people. He watched Nils reset a roller under the wagon box. Then he called up the slope. "Torvald, that's cargo, not a badger hole." The men around him laughed. One teamster spat into the dust and said, "He's planting it. Come spring, maybe it'll grow wheels." Nils did not smile. He stood with both hands on the capstan bar, his breath turning white in the thin morning air. He looked at the black mouth beneath the bluff, then at the men on the road. "It will not have to fight the wind," he said. That was all. No speech, no explanation, just that one sentence. To the men below, it sounded like surrender. A frontier family needed walls, a roof, logs, chinking, a chimney, a door that opened to daylight. Nils was taking the strongest thing he owned and dragging it under rock. They saw a coffin. He saw an anchor. And before winter was done, every man who laughed from that road would understand the difference. Nils Torvald had not grown up in a country of cabins. He came from the high country above Telemark, where the summer pastures were green for only a short breath of the year, and the weather could change so fast a sheep bell disappeared in snow before a man could count 10 steps. His father had built stone byre shelters into the folds of the hills, low rooms, thick walls, turf roofs, small doors, places where a shepherd could survive a storm, not because the fire was enormous, but because the mountain carried most of the burden. That lesson had followed Nils across the ocean, but Wyoming had taught it to him again, brutally. His first winter in the territory had almost broken his family. He and his wife Marta had arrived too late in the season with 2 children, Soren and Elin, a crate of hand tools, 1 iron stove, and a belief that hard work could outrun cold. They built what everyone told them to build, a quick cabin of cottonwood and pine. The logs were green, the chinking cracked, the roof leaked smoke and frost in equal measure. When the first deep cold came, the cabin did not feel like shelter. It felt like a box the winter had permission to enter. At night, the stove glowed red in the corner, angry and hungry. 6 feet away from it, the wash water skinned over with ice. Marta slept in her coat. Soren coughed so hard, his small body folded around the sound. Elin's hair froze where her breath touched the blanket. Nils remembered one morning in particular. He reached for his boots, and the leather did not bend. The laces stood stiff in the air like little black wires. Outside, the smoke from the stovepipe did not rise. It crawled sideways along the ground, pressed down by air so cold it seemed heavier than stone. That was the morning Niels stopped believing a frontier cabin was the answer. Not because the people who built them were foolish. They were practical. They used the material they had. They copied what had worked well enough for the men before them. But in that country, well enough still meant fear. A cabin on open ground had to defend 6 sides at once, 4 walls, a roof, a floor laid over frozen earth. Every crack became an invitation. Every knot in the wood became a path. Every gust pulled warm air out and shoved dead air in. A stove could burn all night and still lose the argument. Because heat is loyal to no one. It moves from warm to cold. Always. A cabin at 60 degrees, standing in air at 30 below, is not a home. It is a leaking account. Every surface is spending warmth. Every minute the debt grows. Men tried to pay that debt with wood. More wood. Bigger wood. Stacks of wood higher than a man's shoulder. 12 cords for a family was not unusual. 15 if the seams were bad. A man could spend September cutting the forest into pieces, and January would still laugh through the walls. Niels saw the mistake differently. The winter was not only attacking from outside. The settlers had built in a way that made outside touch everything. So he looked for a place where outside could be reduced to one face. Not 6, 1. All through late summer, while other men looked for timber stands and level bottoms, Niels walked the bluffs. He carried a hammer, a length of cord, and a candle stub. He was not looking for beauty. He was looking for steadiness, a dry overhang, a deep seam, a bluff that had already survived more winters than any man would ever count. He found it above a bend in a seasonal creek, where the sandstone had been cut inward by ancient water and then abandoned by it. The recess ran back almost 20 feet. The floor was hard pan, flat enough to sweep. The ceiling was low near the mouth, higher inside, with no fresh fall marks beneath it. Niels struck the stone with his hammer. Not a hollow ring, not a fractured chatter, a deep, sleeping sound. He set the candle near the back wall. The flame held steady. No draft. The bluff was dry. That was enough. The freight wagon box became the room. He stripped it down with Marta's help, saving every bolt and iron strap. He laid peeled juniper poles as rollers from the slope to the recess. Then he dragged the wagon shell toward the rock, while the whole road watched him make an object of pity out of himself. It took 3 days to move it the final 20 feet. 3 days of mud on the knees, rope burn in the palms, splinters driven under nails. Marta pushed with her shoulder against the rear planks, while Soren and Elin carried fist-sized stones to chalk the rollers. The wagon box scraped and shrieked all the way in. On the 4th morning, its rear wall touched the back of the sandstone pocket. It looked absurd, a wagon without wheels, swallowed by a bluff. Then Niels began building the only wall that mattered, the front. He cut sod from the creek bottom, each brick thick with roots. He laid the sod grass down in 2 separate faces, like a mason laying stone. Between the 2 faces, he packed clay, gravel, straw, and ash. The wall grew slowly across the opening until the black mouth of the recess became a thick earthen plug. Not pretty, not square, but massive. 26 inches thick in the center, wider than most cabin walls by a full arm's length. He left 1 narrow door, 1 small window no bigger than a ledger book, 1 stovepipe hole sealed tight with clay and stone. Inside the wagon box, he hung the old canvas cover beneath the bows, not over them. That canvas made a second ceiling, a lower ceiling, a warmer ceiling, a room inside the room. Instead of heating every inch of the wagon's height, the stove would heat the space where people actually lived. When Marta first stepped into it, she did not praise him. She ran one hand along the curved canvas above her head, then touched the sandstone wall beside the wagon boards. "It feels buried," she said. Niels nodded. "It is," he answered. She looked toward the little door, the only piece of outside left. Then she said, "Good." Ezra Clapp came back before the first snow. He rode up with 2 men from a grading crew and stood staring at the sod wall. His eyes went to the overhang, to the stovepipe, to the narrow door. "That roof'll come down and thaw," he said. Nils was sealing the last gap around the pipe. "The bluff has carried itself a long time," he said. Clapp tapped his notebook against his glove. "Rock kills men who think it is friendly." Nils looked up then, not angry, not offended, only tired of explaining a thing no one wanted to understand before it proved itself. "I do not need it friendly," he said. "I need it steady." The road crew left, shaking their heads. By the time the first hard freeze locked the creek bed, the story had traveled farther than Niels had. The Norwegian in the dirt cave, the man who buried his children, the wagon coffin. The winter would decide who had the better joke. It arrived early, not as snow first, as silence. A high, merciless cold spread south from the northern plains and settled over the territory like an iron lid. The sky went pale, the wind stopped. At night, the stars looked close enough to cut your hand on. For 19 nights, the temperature at the road station did not climb above 20 below after sunset. On 7 of those nights, the station thermometer touched 40 below. The ordinary cabins began to fail in ordinary ways. That was the cruel part. No drama, no single disaster, just small defeats, one after another. A kettle frozen on the shelf, boots hard as boards, frost blooming around nail heads, smoke backing down a pipe because the air outside had become a weight. Men who had mocked Niels now slept in shifts because the stove could not be allowed to fall asleep. Women moved children from bed to bed, hunting the least cold corner of the room. A milk cow froze one ear in a lean-to only 20 paces from the kitchen door. At Ezra Clapp's own place, the ink in his desk bottle thickened to black paste. His wife kept potatoes under the bed. They froze anyway. By the second week, everyone was burning wood faster than their stacks allowed. The cold had turned every house into a mouth that could not be fed. And under the sandstone bluff, the Torvald home did something strange. It became boring. Not warm like July, not luxurious, not easy. Just steady. The fire in Nils's little stove did not roar, it ticked. A small split log would keep the room in the low 60s for hours because the shelter was not trying to heat the territory, only itself. The canvas ceiling held the warm air down. The sod wall slowed the outside world to a crawl. And behind the wagon boards, around the floor, above the back wall, the earth remained what the air could not be. Constant. This was the whole secret. Not magic, not luck. Mass. A few feet below the reach of the sun and the night wind, ground temperature stops chasing the weather. In that part of Wyoming, deep earth and sheltered stone held in the 40s through much of the year. 44 degrees is not comfort. But to a body standing in 40 below air, 44 degrees is mercy. A normal cabin in that cold was trying to climb an 80 or 100-degree wall every hour. Niels's shelter was different. 3 sides of it did not face winter. They faced earth. The floor did not open into frozen wind. It touched a mass that remembered summer longer than the air remembered anything. If the stove went out in an ordinary cabin, the room fell fast. 30 degrees. 10. 0. Lower. If Nils's stove went out, the room dropped until the earth began pushing back. The bluff and ground could not make it comfortable. But they could keep it from becoming death. That changed everything. The family stopped living in panic. Marta could knead dough with bare hands. Aileen could sit on a buffalo robe and sort buttons by lamplight without her fingers going white. Soren stopped coughing every hour. Water left in a tin cup near the back wall did not freeze. A small crock of yeast kept working through the coldest week, and Nils began doing something that became the real proof of the place. He kept a tray of seed potatoes against the rear wall. Not for eating, for spring. Every farmer in that road district had lost potatoes to cold before. Cellars froze, cabin corners froze, buried pits froze if the frost line reached them. But the potatoes in the back of the buried wagon stayed firm. No black flesh, no glassy centers, no ruin. Outside, men were losing food inside houses. Inside the bluff, next year's crop was waiting quietly in the dark. That was when the shelter stopped being an oddity and became evidence. But the men on the road did not know it yet. They would learn because of a stranger. His name was Caleb Voss, a line rider for the telegraph company, sent out after a section of wire went dead between 2 relay points. He was not a heroic man. He was a stubborn one. That was worse for him. By the time he found the broken line, repaired it with hands he could barely feel, and turned his horse back toward the road station, the light had begun to drain out of the world. His horse stumbled in a crusted wash and came up lame. Caleb cut the animal loose, took the tool roll, and started walking. The cold at dusk was not a temperature anymore. It was an animal. It got into his beard. It sealed his eyelashes. It made the metal buckle on his satchel burn his hip through 2 layers of wool. He followed the creek bed because it gave him a line through the dark. Then, after an hour, he saw something that should not have been there. A thread of smoke. Not a cabin glow. Not a window across a field. Just one thin line rising from the base of a sandstone bluff. Straight up. So delicate in the still air it looked drawn with a pencil. Caleb thought he was seeing the last kindness his mind could invent. Then he saw the door. Small, low, set into a wall of sod and clay, with yellow light leaking around the latch. He fell against it more than knocked. Marta opened the door. Warm air touched his face. He later wrote that it frightened him for 1 second because it felt impossible. No blast of smoke, no desperate heat from an overfed stove, no cabin stink of damp wool and panic. Just dry, still warmth. Coffee, bread, wood ash, a lamp flame that did not tremble. Nils pulled him inside and sat him near the stove. Caleb's eyes moved around the narrow room the way a surveyor's eyes move over a map. The wagon boards, the canvas ceiling, the sod wall, the stone beyond the seams, the potatoes stacked in a wooden tray at the back, 2 children sleeping without coats, a woman cutting bread without gloves. After 10 minutes, when his hands hurt badly enough to prove they were still alive, Caleb looked at Nils and said the line that would travel farther than either of them. You didn't build a warmer cabin. You built less winter. Nils considered that. Then he nodded once. Less winter is enough. Caleb stayed until daylight. Before he left, he asked for the measurements, not out of politeness, out of a working man's need to steal a good idea before memory softened it. Nils drew the cross-section on the back of a telegraph repair form, 20 feet into the bluff. Sod wall, 2 feet thick, canvas ceiling below wagon bows, stovepipe sealed through stone and clay, potato shelf against the rear wall, door facing away from the prevailing wind. Caleb folded the paper into his tool roll like it was more valuable than the wire he had been sent to mend. By the time he reached the station, the story already had a witness the roadmen trusted. Not because Caleb was dramatic, because he was not. He told it plainly. A man could stand inside Torvald's hole in shirt sleeves while ink froze 6 miles away. The children slept, the yeast rose, the seed potatoes lived. That last detail mattered most. Frontier men could argue about comfort. They could argue about whether a man exaggerated a stove. They could not argue with potatoes. When the cold finally broke, Ezra Clapp rode back to the bluff. The road was soft with thaw. Water ran under the crusted snow. Pebbles clicked loose from sunny slopes. The overhang had not fallen. The sod wall had not split. The door still opened. Nils was outside sharpening a draw knife. For a long moment, Clapp said nothing. The notebook was in his hand, but he did not open it right away. Then he stepped inside. The stove was out. That was the first thing he noticed. No fire, no roaring iron, no bed of coals. And still the room was not cold the way a dead cabin was cold. It held a dull, earthy coolness, the kind of cool that did not bite. Clapp removed one glove and pressed his palm to the rear wall. The stone was cool, but not cruel. He looked at the potato tray, at the children's chalk marks on the wagon planks, at the clay packed thick around the stovepipe, at the canvas curve above his head. The idea arrived whole, not as a compliment, as a correction. He had judged the shelter as if it were a bad cabin. It was not a cabin. It was a bargain. The earth took 3 walls. The family built 1. The stove no longer had to defeat the whole sky, only finish what the ground had started. Clapp opened his notebook. He asked Nils to draw it again. This time not on scrap paper, on a clean page. Nils drew the bluff, the wagon box, the sod plug, the lowered canvas ceiling, the stovepipe, the door angle, and the potato shelf. Clapp wrote the phrase above it in block letters. Earth-anchored wagon shelter. A dry, practical name for a thing that had saved 4 lives. The following autumn, 2 trappers built a version of it in a limestone cut near South Pass. A sheep outfit dug a half room into a bank and roofed it with poles and sod. A freighter heading north copied the lowered canvas ceiling in a dugout near a frozen ford. Most of them changed the design. They used what they had. That was the point. The genius was not the wagon. The genius was the refusal to let winter touch every side of the home. Modern builders would later give the idea cleaner words: earth sheltering, thermal mass, ground-coupled design, passive stability. But Nils did not need those terms. He knew the lesson in older language. Wind lies, earth remembers. The wind says every hour is an emergency. The earth keeps a slower account. A wall of boards forgets the fire as soon as the flame dies. A wall of ground remembers the sun that warmed it months before. And on that cold shoulder of Wyoming, a man everybody mocked survived, because he trusted the slower thing. He did not build bigger, he did not burn harder, he did not try to bully the season with more fuel. He changed the shape of the fight. The settlers had built houses that stood proudly against winter. Niels Torvald built one that bowed its head and let the earth hold it. That was why his children slept. That was why the potatoes lived. That was why the smoke above the bluff rose so thin, so calm, and so sure. He stopped trying to outburn winter. He let the earth remember summer for him.